G'day, welcome to the beautiful Burleigh Heads, Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia. We picked a nice little location here, sitting under the pandanus trees, set up just nice and rough, just with the basics. We're just going to do a little painting of this beautiful view of Burleigh Heads and the Gold Coast off into the distance. So let's get started, we'll attack it. Okay. So I've just started off with just a bit of titanium white and some phthalo blue, and we'll get a little bit of colour on the board really quick. Just get rid of that white canvas because we don't like that. Okay. Beautiful blue sky out here, absolute cracker of a day. So we'll just get this covered. So it doesn't really matter about the exact colour at the moment, as long as we get rid of that white canvas. We'll come back and paint over this again in a minute when it starts to dry off. And in this warm weather, with acrylic paint, it dries off really quick. A bit of sun on it. Okay, so we'll map this out with a little brush. What do we got here? That'll do, just a little brush. Okay, so we've got the horizon line along here, so in the edge of the blue water, we'll just mark that in. And that drops down off a bit there. Some rocks and stuff in there. And a beach. So that's our water line, our beach line, and then we've got a heap of trees off into the distance. So we're not worrying about getting too pretty at the moment, just map it in roughly where we are. We've got all these big, beautiful pine trees that go in here, but we can't do them yet because we need to get all this underpaint done first. Beautiful beach there, some rocks. So these rocks aren't blue, but it doesn't matter, we're just mapping it all in at the moment. Okay, that's basically the structure of the painting, so we'll get a bit of white. So this easel is actually just an old chair out of the garden at home. You don't need anything flashed, as long as it's workable, we're in business. There's such a crisp, beautiful blue sky out there today, the sunshine, people everywhere. All behind me here, they're walking up and down the beach and having fun, so there we go. We've got a few board riders out in the distance, getting a bit of surf action. So this first layer is already dry, that I scribbled on there earlier, so it doesn't take long when you're outdoors. Or plein air they call it when you paint outdoors on site. It's called plein air painting. So now we've got that covered, it's just about coming back and building it up. Instead of trying to get everything done perfect in the first go, we just keep building it up and going over it. And that's the beauty of the acrylic, because it dries so quick. So this is just phthalo blue. We'll add other colours on top of this later. So I'm not getting too fancy with it yet. Okay. Okie dokie. Get a bit more colour happening here. Bit of black, bit of Mars black, and we'll get some yellow going. So that's just a nice bright yellow, like a cadmium yellow or any sort of bright yellow. And I'm going to use a bit of burnt sienna as well, just to get that colour for the beach sand. Some more white. So that's just titanium white. I get it in the big tubs because you go through buckets of this stuff sometimes. Okie doke. Right, so that water I put in before, that's already dry, I'd say, virtually. So we can just build that up a little bit darker now. Okay. Some reds. I'll get some red going. Beautiful, beautiful day. So nice down here. And this is winter, so we're really blessed. Have such good weather. Okay. A bit of burnt sienna and a little bit of red there. Still a bit of blue. Just to get a nice darkish sort of colour. I'm going to put all this tree line in the distance. So I don't always like to use black. So, you know, red and a bit of blue, a bit of yellow, whatever, as long as it's dark and get all our shadows in, the dark parts of the trees. So by the time we get back to these trees later, we'll highlight them and put all their greens and some finer details in them, so it's just nice and rough. So never try and get anything with too much detail, like too soon. You just get yourself lost otherwise, so just stay nice and free. Okay, that looks all right. For now, we've got all these rocks down here. The sun's just bouncing off that that water. It's just gorgeous, like little diamonds shining on top. Absolutely gorgeous. Right, so there's just some rocks and a bit of rubbish laying around there. So we'll add a bit more detail obviously into this later. A few more big rocks here. Just pick out some nice shapes down there. And once again, we'll come back and highlight these later too. If I stayed here and tried to paint it absolutely every single rock exactly the way it is, we'd be here all year. So this is just like a sketch, just nice and free. Right, we'll get rid of a bit of that canvas. Hate white canvas. You've got to cover it all as quick as you can just to open up the painting. Okay, now, so a little bit of that burnt sienna and some yellow, a little bit of white. Let's get a bit of a beachy, sandy looking colour there. So I'm going to go a little bit darker than what it actually is because we'll highlight all that later. So see all that dark's nice and dry, so we can just scribble all over the top of that without affecting it too much. Now at least we're starting to get a bit of an idea of where we're going. So by putting the darker blue down first, this lighter colour jumps off a lot better. So, and with acrylic paint, it always seems to dry a little bit darker than when you put it on. It dries a few tones darker, so. Okay. So it's nice and bright and light down the bottom. We just darken it up as we go up the top. That's it. And with an acrylic sketch like this, quite often I like to take it home once I'm finished, back into the studio. You can attack it with oils and really just keep putting more and more detail if that's what you want. But today I'm happy just to get this nice colour in. And so we'll drag a couple of different colour blues into this soon. Just thicken that up a bit. So just as the sky is nice and light at the bottom and then it gets darker towards the top, the water should really be like that as well. It's always lighter in the distance and then it sort of darkens off as you come down and get closer into focus. Okay. Now where was that? So on this layer I'm going to use a little less of the brown, mainly just yellow and the white, just to get this beach happening. Let that dry off for a minute. So Burleigh's a really popular beach on the Gold Coast. It's just a beautiful location, heaps of restaurants and great little coffee shops. Okay, now we're starting to get there. A little bit of shape. All right. So a little bit of yellow, a bit of blue. Just some darker, dirty colour green on there. So I'm using the side of the brush here. And the pressure's just really light, otherwise it's going to be big blobs instead of just dragging. So it's almost like a bit of a dry brush. There's not much water or anything here. It's just paint. So I haven't thinned it down too much for this part. Maybe put a bit of green into some of those rocks. Okay. A little bit more highlight on this beach. This is a bit more white and yellow. So it doesn't matter really if you make a bit of a blue at this stage, because it dries so fast, this acrylic, you can come back and paint over your mistakes. So don't get too tight, just try and keep it nice and loose, because that brings out the more, more expression, I think. So you're not too bound up in detail. So they're all starting to take form slowly. What can we do now? Let's slap a little bit more colour on that sky. That's another good thing about the acrylic, that's not, you haven't got terps and stuff to worry about. So this coat, I'm doing a little bit meatier, a little bit more paint on the brush. It's not so thin as not as thin as the first couple of coats. So a couple of tones darker right at the top. So we'll get a little bit of wave action happening along this beach here. So by putting that darker blue down to start with, every time we put a bit of lighter colour on top, it jumps off a lot easier. So okay. Right then, so we've got a couple of buildings sticking up in the background there, so we may as well try and get some of that in now. So once again, this is the blue and the red and a little bit of white, get a grey, dirty colour, a bit more blue. Okay, so okay. So the colours here, once again, that's just a little bit of red and blue and some whites mixed together. And it doesn't really matter, as long as it's they look grey and just building colour, I don't know, you could sort of use anything really, because we'll come back later and just add a little bit more colour to make each building a bit more individual. And pick out some windows and start putting all the little bits of detail. So we just want to get something down on the canvas straight away, and then we can go over it and put all the detail in later. So it's about midday here at the moment, so there's not a lot of shade or anything on any one side of the buildings. So just try and give them a bit of shape. Okay. There we go. We'll just put some more darks in these trees before we highlight anything. So it's just a little bit of the blue and red together. I don't like to use black, it's a little bit, it depends on what you're painting of course, but it can be pretty harsh, so just making up dark colours from reds and blues gives you a bit of depth in the shadows as well. So it's just impressions. If we try to put every window in, it takes about 3 weeks. You'd get a bit bored by the end of it. So I'm not after a picture perfect painting today, just the feeling of the beach and the sunshine and sand. So we can come back and keep playing with these as we go. Just keep adding a little bit more detail each time. A few pine trees happening in the foreground all the way along there as well. We'll water that down a bit. So like I said about covering the canvas, just get it down, come back and tidy it up later. Otherwise you just get too caught up in the detail. Okay. A little bit more highlight on the beach. And some more colour. So where are we? We've got a nice little bit of turquoise type of colour here, just for a bit of variation in the water. So that turquoisey colour sort of gives you like shallow water in the sand, it's like a greeny colour. You can use phthalo blue sometimes, phthalo green I should say, with a bit of white mixed in it, give you the same effect. So that little bit of green in there with that blue, it just really helps jump it off a bit. Back to some more darks here, a little bit of, I'm going to put red and black and a little bit of blue just to strengthen these rocks up a bit. So because we've done it rough and painted over it a few times and there's bits all over the place there, it gives you a little bit of underpaint on certain parts. Just makes it more interesting. You can just come along and tap into a few little detail parts. Pull out a few shapes. The sound of the ocean, gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. All right, so these are just getting a little bit stronger as we go. So the more darks I put on and come back with highlights again over the top, it just strengthens the whole thing here. There we go. A little bug on there. So you can make it more painterly by putting some thicker, bit meatier paint on now. Okay. So back to the yellow and the white and a tiny bit of that burnt sienna. We'll just get a little bit more highlight on some of those rocks. So they start to take shape. So we're just picking out a few highlights. So we've actually painted over these rocks quite a few times now, so there's lots of little colours in them popping through. So they're all starting to pop individually now. Marvellous. All right. Okay, so we're just starting to put a little bit more colour and a little bit more detail into these buildings. Like I said, if you try and put too much in too quick, you just get lost. So just by coming back and adding a little bit more now and then, same as the rocks and the trees, you just slowly build it all up. And I've been going from here to there to back to, to different parts, because each time I leave one section it's drying off for me to come back to. So, and like I said, in this weather it just dries so jolly quick, which is really good. So we'll tidy up these trees just with a bit of dark colour. So we've got a little bit of black and red here. We'll run those trunks right through. So these look really dark and gruesome at the moment, but we'll come along and get some really nice bright green highlights on these, and they'll start to jump. So it looks quite dark, but that's the way it is until we get the highlights on. So they should really pop out once we finish. And they're the old Norfolk pines. They're all over the coast in Australia. Just about every beach in Australia's got Norfolk pines. So they're virtually just expressions, just little impressions of trees. Now we can get a little bit of green colour. I'll just put a bit more detail in these. Right, so we back to the blue, just that tiny bit of phthalo blue and a bit of that bright yellow. Get a nice bright green for the mid-tones. Start popping a bit of that on here and there. So mix a little bit of brown, the burnt sienna with this yellow now. And some whites. Try and get that piney colour there. A highlight for the pine trees. So let's have a look. more white in there. So now all those darks that we put in behind this sort of looking good. It pops these highlights right out. And remember that it always dries just that little bit darker, so we can make it a little bit brighter. Try and flatten this brush out a little bit on the edge here just to capture a few highlights. These big trunks. A lot of stuff hiding back in the base of those trees, so just little buildings and people and bikes and things all back there, so just add a little bit of confusion in there, makes it nice and busy. So because we got all those darks in the background, you can do these things. It just really pops out. And all of a sudden it starts looking like there's lots of detail all over the shop where there actually isn't. Okay. So a little bit of red always jumps out. So if I was to try and capture every single little piece of detail in this painting, like it'd take you forever. But just to get a nice, free, flowing, nice little work like this is great fun. Great fun. All right. So get a little bit more white here from the waves, splashing up on those rocks. Oh, I can smell food too. It smells fantastic. I don't know what it is. There's plenty going on down here today. There we go, look at that. So we've got a little bit of more highlight here. So once again, there's really light pressure on the brush. It's hardly touching the canvas, just to drag it on really nice and lightly. Beautiful. So it's just starting to come to life. So where are we? A little bit of white here, and some of that burnt sienna. Some fleshy tones. And pop some people back in there. So this is just impressions of bodies. There's no real detail, as you can see, but it just adds a little bit of action to the painting. Make sure my hand's clean. A mistake. Okay, here we go. Just a couple of little.
I got a little oil for you.
A couple of little heads and bits and people, bits and pieces. So it's all about colour. Nice, bright, beautiful colours. And we can get a little bit of blue back in there now. So there's just little blobs of paint all over the shop, and it just creates so much activity and starting to get busy. So from this, a sketch like this can really free you up, and it enables you to get back into the studio if you want, and you can paint over it with oils, or you can just keep applying more and more detail, or you can leave the jolly thing the way it is because it's so punchy and good fun. As long as you enjoy what you're doing, you have to enjoy when you paint. So let your hair down, don't worry about detail. Detail has its place in certain paintings, but today it's just all about fun. Get some dark blues in this foreground. So as it dries, you can just keep coming back and just adding detail and highlights and more darker tones. You can just keep building it as long as you want. And if you make a blue, like I said, you can just paint over it 5 minutes later once it's dried off. Whereas with oils, you know, you're stuck. You've got to wait for a few days for it to dry. So it's a lot more confidence required with an oil painting. Okay, there we go. Happy days. Hope you learnt something from this. I think, yeah, it's just all about colour and being free. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.